Lynn, the city of sin. You never come out the way you came in. What's up, everybody? Welcome back. First off, let me shout out Winston Chu, who always asks me to make more content about Asian American organizations. So here you are. Also, shout out to a very helpful viewer that wishes to stay anonymous. He hit me up months ago with information. He probably was beginning to think that I wasn't going to use it. I appreciate him taking the time to reach out, and thank you to everybody that contributes to this channel in any way, shape, or form. I've always wanted to make a video or actual multiple videos about Lynn. My dad moved to Lynn in the late 1950s when he was like 8 years old. Him, my uncle, my yaya, and papu moved from the old Columbia Point housing project in Dorchester to a triple-decker. I think it was on Church Street in Lynn. My father said they tore down all the triple-deckers on that street during urban renewal and put up a big apartment complex. I guess this happened a lot throughout the city. When I was a kid, he was always telling wild stories about groups of kids brawling in the street in the 50s. Kind of like West Side Story, just without the singing and dancing. Then when he got older, the stuff he saw working in the old Lynn Hospital, not Lynn Union Hospital, but there was another hospital as well. I don't know if it was Lynn General or what the name it was. But in the late 1960s and 70s, he saw some crazy stuff go down in that hospital. So as a kid pre-internet, I was fascinated by these stories, and so were my neighborhood friends as well. See, growing up, it wasn't like that for us. The biggest brawls we had were during street hockey games. I got cousins that live in Lynn, and we used to always go up there for Greek Easter and St. George's Greek Festival in the summer. My cousins owned a little convenience store that sold Greek products as well as normal corner store stuff. I remember they had this sick arcade game in the back of the store called Spy Hunter. I don't know if anybody remembers that game. It was like the best arcade game ever. They used to have it at the Clam Box in Ipswich as well. I was definitely obsessed with it, and I used to make my yaya and Uncle John go to the store all the time. The store was on Henry Ave, and my cousins lived in the building right next door, and they rented 2 floors and lived on the bottom floor. That neighborhood was pretty rough back in the late 80s and 90s. This store would get robbed almost on a regular basis. My cousin Johnny, who by the way was a Lynn classical sports star, maybe not a star, but he was a real good athlete. A couple guys put him on the ground and emptied the register one night while he was working alone at the store and he was in high school. His mom, my Aunt Delaney, who was like a crazy Greek lady, was so heated, she said the next person that tried to rob the store was going to get it. I remember her screaming in Greek on the phone to my yaya. Anyway, Lynn has more than earned its reputation as a rough city. While a lot of people from inner city Boston think Lynn isn't as tough as their neighborhoods, north of Boston, Lynn definitely stands alone. I hope you guys realize that wasn't really my school picture that I put up there. I just pulled it off the internet, right? So Lynn, Massachusetts is the largest city in Essex County, which is the county that I hail from. It varies with population fluxes in the census, but Lynn is usually in the top 10 largest cities in Massachusetts. Most people would consider Lynn the edge of Boston's northern urban metropolitan area. If you take a train north of the city, though, the urban sprawl really goes on till about Beverly before you hit large patches of forest. Gloucester, and to a smaller extent Newburyport, for a long time were the only somewhat more concentrated areas north of this. Besides that, it was mostly rural and sparse. Now all these towns are being built up and marketed to a more upscale clientele. Lynn is the 5th oldest colonial settlement in the Commonwealth. It was settled in 1631. It was originally part of Saugus, which was the native name for an area which is part of present-day Lynn, Saugus, and I think part of Wakefield as well. But after Lynn was incorporated as its own town, and through the 1800s the city began to boom. When the Industrial Revolution began, it changed Lynn from any other small colonial town into a manufacturing hub. Just like Holyoke had the paper mills and Gardner, Mass. Was known as the furniture capital of the world, specifically the chair, Lynn became known as the center of shoe manufacturing in the United States, and for the world too, for that matter. By the mid-1880s, waves of immigrants were coming to America to try to find work in the bustling new industrial wave sweeping the nation. Many people from Eastern and Southern Europe were coming to America in search of a better life. Many left poverty, persecution, and other hopeless prospects, but a lot of times these immigrants found upon their arrival wasn't much better than what they had left. Life in the northern tenements and horrible working conditions in factories were their new realities. But many persevered and created a new life in America. Lynn, Mass. During this time period became a mecca for newly arrived immigrants looking for housing and work. From 1885 to 1915, Lynn saw the immigrant population jump from 9,800 to 29,500, making up roughly one-third of the city's total population. The first and largest immigrant population to arrive in the city were Jewish people from Eastern Europe, primarily Russia and Poland. Huge number of Jewish immigrants also settled in the neighboring city of Chelsea, which also had large shoe factories. I never really knew that until recently. I guess they even referred to Chelsea as the Jerusalem of the United States. The first wave of Jewish immigrants to Lynn was around 6,000 people. In this group, there was a small group of Hasidic Jews who started an Orthodox temple in Lynn. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe would make up one-third of the total immigrants that arrived to Lynn during this period. Other large notable groups that came to Lynn around the turn of the century were represented in various Catholic parishes. For the large French-Canadian population that came to work in the shoe factories, there was the St. Jean-Baptiste parish. Not only were there a lot of Jewish people who immigrated from Poland, but also many Polish Catholics. This large number of Polish Catholics went to services at St. Michael's. The Italian population listened to services in their native language at the Holy Family Church. And I'll let you guys guess what ethnic group went to St. Patrick's Catholic Church. Let us not forget about St. George's Greek Orthodox Church, my yaya's old parish. Lynn used to have a strong Greek presence back in the 20th century. Throughout the 1900s, Lynn's manufacturing prowess grew. At the city's height, it boasted 234 active shoe factories, producing around 1 million pairs of shoes a day. Apparently, Lynn's history with shoemaking goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. The city was responsible for making shoes for the entire colonial army. Two shoe tycoons pulled their resources together in the 1800s and invested in the new electric industry. Specifically, the two men Charles A. Coffin and Silas Abbott Barton invested in the Thomas and Houston Electric Company. The later two merged with Edison Electric in Schenectady, New York, and created General Electric. The two original plants were in Schenectady, New York, and Lynn, Mass. Lynn was a manufacturing powerhouse throughout the first half of the 20th century. The waves of European immigrants fueled this large workforce. Through the 20th century, the shoe industry began to decline. My yaya was one of the first female foremen at the United Shoe Factory. I guess it was a crazy big old factory building and probably been a cool place to explore back in the day. My father also worked there. I think it was his first job when he was 14. I think he got fired or quit or something like that. I think Yaya was a hard boss. Luckily for the city, they still had GE, which employed a lot of Lynn's residents. By 1981, the last shoe factory had been boarded up. The contracts for manufacturing shoes were being outsourced to foreign countries for cheaper labor. GE was pretty steady throughout the 20th century, but it wasn't enough to support Lynn's entire economy. In the second half of the 20th century, Lynn fell on some hard times. By the 1970s, Lynn was beginning to look like a worn-out old mill city. Lots of big old factories and vacants downtown. I will say I always have and still to this very day find downtown Lynn to be very beautiful. Some of the buildings are amazing with the old architecture, and they've been letting artists paint murals on the side of the old buildings downtown, and it's actually very beautiful. By the late 1970s, a lot of families that could afford it were moving to other cities and towns in the North Shore area. Some to be closer to work, or some just wanted to live and raise their children in a nicer, safer community. Throughout the late 1950s, 60s, and 70s, groups of neighborhood kids were banding together, but it wasn't anything organized. It was just kids rumbling in the street, like I said before. Kids from different schools would show up to other kids' schools and try to fight. As the economy dropped and the crime rate raised, Lynn was beginning to earn a reputation that still exists to this very day. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, the demographics of Lynn started to shift. At the turn of the 20th century, it was mostly Eastern and Southern Europeans who had immigrated to Lynn, but after WW2, millions of Southern blacks moved north in what historians and sociologists call the Great Migration. As I've spoken about in previous videos, the South End and then Roxbury were the heart of Black Boston. Also later, this included Mattapan and parts of Dorchester and Jamaica Plain as well. Lynn, to a smaller scale, became a landing spot for a good number of black people. By 1980, black people made up almost 15% of Lynn's total population. I think some families might have relocated from Boston to Lynn for various reasons, but I believe there was also a decent amount of families that came right from the South and settled directly in Lynn. I'm not sure if it's still like this, but I remember when I was in jail around the year 2001, when I was younger, a lot of guys would claim Boston even if they lived in Lynn 98% of their life. It was almost like they felt they couldn't be taken serious unless they said they were from Boston. Specifically, there was one kid who I was doing time with on 80 Lower in 2001, and he used to say like he lived in Lynn, but he was from Boston. I don't know, it was Mattapan or Dorchester or Roxbury, but everybody who's from Lynn was like, nah, he's from Lynn. He's like always lived in Lynn. Maybe he was born and lived in Boston, but he ended up losing his life like about 10 years after, I think in 2009 and 2010, after we were locked up together. And he didn't lose his life in Boston, he lost his life in Lynn. So I'm not saying that this proves that Lynn's as dangerous as Boston, because it's not. Those neighborhoods in Boston are more dangerous, but Lynn is dangerous as well. It may not be as dangerous, but it is dangerous. I never really got this because I always thought Lynn was like a real tough town. I live in Gloucester though, so I guess everything's relative. In the late 1970s, the first wave of Lynn's Hispanic population started to show up in the city. Latinos now make up the largest percentage of any ethnic group or race in the city. The first wave are mostly Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico being a U.S. territory meant its residents were now U.S. citizens as well. Then in the late 1980s and early 90s, Dominicans started moving into the city. This group is deep in the city, not quite like Lawrence, but there is a good-sized Dominican population in Lynn. The second highest Dominican population in the United States is in the Boston metro area, second only to New York City. In the 1990s, a small Colombian population also settled in Lynn. Then finally, after the turn of the millennium, the last wave of Latinos were primarily from Central America and southern Mexico. Most of the immigrants came from countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Many were fleeing bad situations in their homelands, so Lynn actually seemed like a refuge to them. Now finally, the smallest of the major ethnic groups in the city of Lynn, Asians, primarily Southeast Asians. In today's statistics, Lynn is pretty diverse, especially for Essex County standards. The population of the city is 42% Latino, 41% white, 12% black, and 5% Asian. The majority of the Southeast Asians that immigrated to the United States in the 1970s and 80s were actually refugees. Millions of people were displaced in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other countries by decades-long conflicts there. And many spent years in refugee camps before settling into the United States. When these refugees arrived, even the tough cities like Lowell or Lynn seemed welcoming compared to where they had been. I think the situation was similar in Lynn as it was in Lowell. There was probably an excess of affordable housing in Lynn to accommodate the new residents. By the early 1980s, Lynn was a pretty run-down old manufacturing industrial city. A lot of residents left for greener pastures, leaving plenty of open apartments for these refugees. The two major Southeast Asian groups that settled in Lynn were Vietnamese and Cambodians. It's nothing like Lowell, Mass, which I made a video about a while ago, which boasts the second highest Cambodian population in the country behind only Long Beach, California. In Lowell, 23% of the total population, between 25 and 30,000 people, are Cambodian. While they're also Lynn's biggest Asian ethnic group, there's only a little over 3,000 living in Lynn. The second largest group, Vietnamese, boasts a population of a little over 1,000. Boston became one of the top 10 resettlement sites in the country for Vietnamese refugees. That's why there's such a large population in the Bay State. A lot of ethnically Chinese Vietnamese settled on the fringes of Chinatown, while most other Vietnamese residents settled around Boston and Allston, Brighton, parts of East Boston, and Dorchester. Fields Corner in Dorchester became kind of a hub for Vietnamese people. By 1990, Fields Corner contained 1/3 of all Massachusetts Vietnamese. A lot of the first-generation Vietnamese and Cambodians worked hard in factories, warehouses, and as laborers. Many saved up living multiple families in one apartment or house. They used the money to start their own businesses for future generations, like restaurants, beauty and nail salons. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but when I worked for a contractor, it seemed like Vietnamese people do every hardwood floor job there ever was. While the vast majority of newly arrived Asian immigrants assimilated and lived productive lives, a small percentage, mostly young men, were drifting towards the streets in a life of crime and chaos. It couldn't have been easy for any of these kids to establish themselves in a new land, not understanding the customs, not speaking the language. Going to school every day and getting picked on usually will force someone into action. Being the smallest group and the newest to have arrived, the young Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian teens began clicking up in the city of Lynn. So the viewer that contacted me and helped me with information on this video grew up with a lot of Cambodians and Laotians in the late 90s and early 2000s, so that's the period that I'm going to focus on in this video. Another reason I won't go into a great detail about other street organizations in Lynn during this time period is because I'm hoping that people who see this video might contact me and give me more accurate information than I can find myself. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure that the C-Dubs were started by a group of kids from Lynn, but now it's a large faction in Middleton Jail. I'm pretty sure I was locked up with a few of these guys back in 2001. I'm not going to say any names, but if they want to contact me, that would be awesome. Very different than Boston, Lynn was full of organizations that started in other cities and states, like the guys that wear blue and red, guys that use the Star of David, and others that use a crown. Obviously, being the newest and smallest group to arrive, a lot of the Asian teens in the city started clicking up. Apparently, by the late 90s, the city was starting to become separated between East Lynn and West Lynn, with one side predominantly wearing blue and the other predominantly wearing red. So on the west side of Lynn, or the red side, there was OB and the YB, the O standing for original and the Y standing for young. You guys can guess what the B stands for. These sets were multiracial, not specifically Asian, but they were started by people with Cambodian ancestry. Apparently OB is originally from Stockton, California, and the two cities were tied in. There was also BRD, or the Boston Red Dragons. The main areas on the west side where these groups claimed were Warren Street, Elm Street, and Elmwood Ave. Warren Park was a main hangout where a lot of these crews would hang. On the east side, or the blue side, there was the KCG, the K standing for Khmer, which is what Cambodians refer to themselves as. There were also the LCG, L standing for Little. Apparently they were kind of a junior group to the KCG, but ended up becoming deeper than their predecessor. These two groups centered around Beaudry Terrace and Fayette Street. Another large group that is mixed racially was AKC, the AK standing for Avenue Kings. I'm pretty sure that they used to rock purple, if I'm not mistaken. The last groups that I mentioned, except for OB, were all homegrown sets, but ASW, or the Asian Streetwalkers, apparently also originated in Stockton, California. They actually held some real estate on the west side on Light Street. Also in Lynn are sets of the Asian Boys. While that group originally started in Long Beach, California, I've heard that guys from Lowell, Mass started the sets in Lynn, not guys from Cali. The Asian Boys also had real estate on the traditional blue east side, but also on the red west side around Mall Street. Apparently the red side by Warren Park was the most visible presence in all of the city. If you did not know someone over there that didn't have business, you weren't exactly welcome there. Another large national group that didn't wear blue or red set up in Lynn as well. Tiny Rascals, which originated in Cali, were predominantly Cambodian but have become progressively more multiracial over the years. They usually rock a gray bandana. They don't claim an actual block like the other groups in Lynn, but they're more mobile, but they're mostly found on the west side of the city. I hope I didn't confuse people. I wasn't trying to say that the Asian Boys had a strong presence in Warren Park. I was just saying that the guys who are from Warren Park had some of the strongest presence in the city out of any other neighborhood. That's all I was trying to say. BRD, or the Boston Red Dragons, are also in Revere and East Boston, I think even Chelsea to a small extent. The area around Shirley Ave and Revere in the late 90s became a large concentration of Cambodian residents. It was originally a blue area, but when word got out that non-affiliated citizens were getting bullied, BRD came in and pushed the other faction out. BRD and Lynn, Revere, and East Boston are all linked up. I'm pretty sure they've banded up to fight different Central American organizations that dominate the area as well. Hit me up in the comments if you have any more info on that. Apparently, the things that went down on Shirley Ave, a lot of those guys are doing decades in prison and sometimes life. On Shirley Ave and some of these neighborhoods in Lynn, I've seen firsthand how deep some of these guys roll. Especially in the early 2000s, they were rolling extremely deep, believe me. As far as homegrown groups go, Lynn has some notable ones as well. While there's literally almost every brand of national organization in the city, the only one that I can't think of off the top of my head is one from Chicago with the initials VL, but I'm sure there's a set somewhere in Lynn. One of the most notorious groups in Lynn's history is a homegrown group. The Deuce Boys are responsible for turning the city upside down in 2006 and 7. The Deuce Boys were a mixed gang racially. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but the story I always heard was that it was a traditionally Cambodian crew and a Latino crew that came together and formed the Deuce Boys. While not officially part of the Red Squad, they did side with them when things got down to the nitty-gritty. After almost a decade of squabbling between the two sides, things exploded at the end of 2006. In the first couple months of 2007, there was 15 incidents including assaults with heavy machinery. The Lynn police called the feds for backup. The Soldiers were also another homegrown crew from Lynn. They were originally, I believe, like a set of little homies or something for the Deuce Boys, but they ended up becoming just like peers to them. Like the Deuce Boys, they sided with the guys rocking red on the west side, but weren't officially part of that squad. I'd like to make a further video about what was going on in Lynn at this time period, so hopefully people that were involved in this will see this video and be willing to talk to me so I can get some good first-hand information. I was going up to Lynn daily to cop at that time, and it was pretty wild. Middleton Jail was crazy too because the majority of these guys were there waiting trial before they went upstate or to the feds. If I'm not mistaken, I think they might have started 120B with the two separate tier systems to separate these guys. 120B, the top tier and the bottom tier, are rivals and they never get let out at the same time. Don't quote me on that because it might not be completely true, but I feel like I remember that's why they started doing that back then. So Lynn has always been a wild city to me. Since hearing my dad telling the stories to me when I was a little kid about the street rumbles he used to see, to the HAs coming into the Lynn hospital to finish off their rivals, to the crews that I personally experienced in the late 90s and early 2000s. I purposely am not talking about a lot of stuff that's going on in the city today. If people want me to talk about it, I will, but I'd rather tread lightly first and see how people respond. Because although it's quieter than it was in '07, it's still a very active city, certainly the most on the North Shore of Boston. I'd really love to do more content in Lynn and its very deeply entrenched street world. It's very different than the much bigger city of Boston just 15 minutes south. I really hope people will hit me up that were involved in the red versus blue struggle, specifically Deuce Boys and Soldiers versus I think it was primarily AKC, the Avenue Kings, but I'm pretty sure it was basically anybody wearing blue versus anybody wearing red. I'm not sure if the Deuce Boys are still operating anymore, and if so, it's probably on a much smaller scale than it was in the early 2000s. Lynn's a safer city now than it was in the 90s and early 2000s as well, but it's definitely still the most dangerous place on the North Shore. It's most certainly still a narcotics hub. Besides Lawrence and the Merrimack Valley, Lynn is the go-to spot north of Boston. Residents in the many wealthy communities within a half-hour drive of Lynn arrive there day and night, fueling this underground economy. Many addicts take the train to Lynn Central Station as well to go cop. Back when I was a teen, guys from Lynn would come down and set up shop in some girl's apartment in Maplewood Park or Riverdale Park in Gloucester. They would trap until they made enough money to leave or they got busted by the GPD. Sometimes they would even put on some kids from Gloucester. I remember the first time I went to Middleton in 2001, a couple Spanish kids on 240D were pressing me. They were convinced I was a Deuce Boy from Riverdale Park, which I clearly was not. If you guys think I was talking a little funny in this video and I was avoiding certain words, I was. I'm still trying to master the YouTube speak so they don't cancel the ads on my videos. I think I'm getting there. We'll find out when they run the checks on this video, because usually when I talk about this kind of content, they always don't run the ads on it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know I said I was going to have a video on Saturday morning, even though I put out the Bobby and Whitney video midweek. Sorry, I know it's coming out Sunday afternoon, but you're still getting this video, and I promise I have a real doozy coming next week, so be ready for that. If you want to hear more about the underworld of Sin City, let me know, because I barely scratched the surface in this video. I'd love to cover all the Lynn Street organizations, not just the Asian ones. I'd love to talk to some of the original Deuce Boy or Soldier members, or even AKC or guys on that side for that matter. Anyone that was around or involved in this crazy time period that could give me first-hand information. Please too also, if anybody knows or if there's any of the original CWBs from the Lynn that are watching this, I'd love to talk to you guys, because I'm pretty sure, people correct me if I'm wrong, did the Middleton jail group, the C-Dubs, did they evolve from the CWBs in Lynn? I think like a lot of the original guys I was locked up with in the early 2000s were like the original guys that started that, but I could be wrong. Hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you for indulging me for my history lesson in the beginning about Lynn. It's very near and dear to my heart. I used to love listening to my yaya tell the stories about working in the shoe factory when I was a little kid. If you like this video, please hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, but most importantly, guys, make good choices, make good decisions, take good care of yourselves, your family, your friends, your fellow human beings. Try to have a good day. I'll talk to you guys soon. God bless.